There are moments in war when the weight of a single decision doesn't fall on armies or governments or nations or alliances. It falls on one man, in one room, in the dead of night, with the fate of millions resting entirely on what he chooses to do next. I have lived long enough to understand what that kind of pressure actually feels like. Not as an abstraction, not as a historical concept, but as a physical thing. Something that sits in the chest and makes the air feel thicker and turns every clock in the room into an accusation. I have stood in enough places where the wrong decision meant men died, where the right decision meant men died too. Just fewer of them. And that distinction, that terrible, unbridgeable arithmetic, is the one that follows you home when the fighting is over, and sits beside your bed in the dark. For the rest of your life, patient and permanent and unwilling to be reasoned with. I have watched commanders break under it. I have seen good men, honest men, men of genuine intelligence and genuine courage and genuine love for the people in their care, make the wrong call in those moments because the weight of the worst realistic outcome became too heavy to carry, and something in them simply gave way under the load. And then, rarely, almost never, perhaps once or twice in a century if history is generous, I have seen a man look straight into that abyss, understand with complete clarity what he was looking at, feel the full terror of it without flinching or looking away, and choose the one path that no rational leader, no cautious politician, no sensible strategist, no responsible administrator would have dared to take. Winston Churchill was that man, and what he did in the late spring and early summer of 1940 wasn't merely a military decision or a political calculation, or even a particularly courageous act in the ordinary sense of that word. The sense that means physical bravery in the face of personal danger. It was something larger and stranger and more consequential than any of those things. It was an act of pure will, so fierce and so defiant of all logic and precedent and reasonable expectation, that it changed the course of human history in ways that most of us are still living inside without fully understanding where they came from or what it cost to produce them. You need to understand what that moment truly was, not the version that has been cleaned up by subsequent victory, not the mythology that forms around men once history has proven them right and their opponents wrong, not the story that nations tell themselves to feel better about the darkness they pass through, but the actual thing, in the actual darkness, before anyone in that room or anywhere else on Earth knew how it was going to end. By June of 1940, the war was already lost by every conventional measure that military professionals and political analysts used to evaluate such things, and most of the people responsible for fighting it knew it. France had fallen not slowly, not after a prolonged and heroic resistance that exhausted the enemy and bought time for other solutions to develop, but with a swiftness that stunned the entire world, including the Germans themselves, including the planners who had designed the campaign, and the commanders who had executed it with a speed and violence that exceeded their own most optimistic projections. The Wehrmacht had driven armored columns through the Ardennes forest, which French strategic doctrine had declared impassable, and which the Allied command had therefore left lightly defended, emerging behind the Allied lines and cutting off the British Expeditionary Force from both its supply lines and its French allies in a matter of days. The speed of it was almost incomprehensible to people trained on the grinding attritional warfare of the previous generation. Armies that had been positioned to fight one kind of war found themselves being destroyed by a completely different kind of war, and the gap between what they had prepared for and what they were facing was so wide that it could not be closed by courage or determination or anything else. Individual soldiers could supply from their own reserves of human will. The British Expeditionary Force, more than 330,000 men, the core of the professional British Army, the force that represented years of training and equipping, and the accumulated military expertise of a generation, had been driven to the beaches of Dunkirk, and though the evacuation that followed over 9 desperate days was a miracle of improvisation and collective determination, and the particular stubbornness that the British bring to situations that have already been declared hopeless, it saved those men without their weapons, without their armor, without their artillery, without their vehicles and their equipment, and the material infrastructure that transforms a group of armed individuals into a coherent fighting force capable of resisting an enemy in the field. They came home alive. They came home to a country that celebrated their survival, because survival itself had become something to celebrate. But they came home to a nation that was now, in terms of its capacity to resist a determined German invasion across 21 miles of English Channel, in a condition that honest military assessment could only describe as desperate, and which privately, in the classified assessments that did not circulate beyond the highest levels of government, was described in terms considerably bleaker than that. Norway had been lost. Belgium had been overrun and had surrendered. The Netherlands had capitulated after Rotterdam was bombed into rubble in a single afternoon as a demonstration of what non-compliance would cost. Denmark had been occupied in a single day without meaningful military resistance, the speed of its fall so complete and so efficient that it seemed almost designed to make a point about the futility of opposition. Luxembourg had simply ceased to exist as an independent state, and now the most powerful military force on the European continent, an army that had just demonstrated, in the space of 6 weeks, that it could destroy the combined military forces of France and Britain and Belgium and the Netherlands with a speed and completeness that rewrote everything that military doctrine had assumed about the nature of modern warfare, and the balance of power between offense and defense, sat just 21 miles across the English Channel, in possession of every major port and airfield and strategic asset on the French and Belgian and Dutch and Norwegian coastlines, staring at the white cliffs of Dover with every reason to believe that Britain was the next item on the agenda, and no particular reason, based on the evidence available, to expect that Britain would prove more capable of resisting it than France had been. The question being asked in military headquarters and government offices and the private conversations of people who understood the situation was not whether Germany could invade Britain successfully. The question was whether Germany would choose to, and when, and whether anything Britain could do in the time available would be sufficient to change the answer. The Royal Air Force was stretched thin, fighting desperately to maintain enough operational strength to be relevant in the battle that everyone could see coming, losing pilots and aircraft at rates that the training pipeline and the production lines could not immediately replace. The Royal Navy, though still the most formidable surface fleet in the world, faced a growing and increasingly effective campaign by German submarines in the Atlantic that threatened the sea, lanes on which Britain depended for food and raw materials and weapons, and its ability to prevent a determined German crossing of the Channel was more limited than public confidence in British naval power suggested. The army that had returned from Dunkirk would need months, realistically, many months, to equip and retrain and rebuild the organizational infrastructure that had been left behind on the beaches of France. The home defense forces that would have to fight on the beaches and in the fields and in the streets and in the towns if the Germans crossed were inadequately armed, inadequately equipped, and in many cases possessed of weapons gathered from factories and museums and private collections in weeks of frantic emergency preparation that spoke more to the desperation of the situation than to any confidence that the preparations would be sufficient. There were serious, sober, experienced professional military officers in the summer of 1940 who looked at everything they knew and everything they could observe and concluded, in the privacy of their own honest assessment, that if the Germans chose to mount a major invasion of Britain in the near term, Britain did not have the means to stop them. Inside the War Cabinet, the pressure to seek a negotiated settlement was immense, and it came not from weakness or cowardice or any failure of patriotic feeling, but from a clear-eyed, and in many respects entirely reasonable reading of a military and strategic situation that the available evidence described in terms of extreme peril. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, a man of genuine intelligence and genuine patriotism, a man who had served his country with dedication and ability across decades of distinguished public life, believed that Britain had reached, or was rapidly approaching, the end of its practical military options, and that the responsible course of action in such a situation was to explore whether any diplomatic alternative remained before those options were exhausted entirely. He was looking at the same intelligence reports Churchill was looking at. He was receiving the same military assessments. hearing the same analyses of German capabilities and British vulnerabilities, reading the same projections about what an invasion would cost and what the odds of successful resistance actually were. And what he concluded from that information was not dishonorable, was not foolish, was not the product of a failure of nerve or a deficiency of love for his country. It was, in many respects, the conclusion that any rational analyst applying standard strategic logic to the available evidence would have found it difficult to avoid. Halifax believed there might still be a window narrow, closing, but not yet closed, within which Britain could negotiate terms through Mussolini's Italy as a potential mediator. Terms that might preserve some meaningful degree of British sovereignty and independence. Terms that might protect the empire and the institutions and the particular way of organizing public life that Britain had spent centuries building and that millions of people around the world depended on and looked to. He was not arguing that Hitler was trustworthy or that Nazi Germany was a regime with which decent people could do comfortable business over the long term. He was arguing that the alternative to negotiation, continuing a war against an enemy that had just demolished the combined military forces of Western Europe in 6 weeks, with no reliable allies, with a shattered army, with a stretched air force, with a civilian population that was about to experience aerial bombardment on a scale that no European city had yet endured, would cost hundreds of thousands of British lives in might. Despite all that cost and all that suffering, end in total defeat and an occupation far harsher than any negotiated settlement that retained some British agency in the terms could possibly be. Churchill had been Prime Minister for barely 3 weeks when these deliberations began in earnest. He had come to power not as anyone's first choice, not as the preferred candidate of the conservative establishment that still dominated British political life, not as the man most of his colleagues believed was temperamentally suited for the highest office in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. He had come to power as the last option available when all others had been tried and found wanting, and the situation had become so dire that even an erratic, difficult, theatrical, occasionally unquestionably brilliant man who drank too much and slept too little and had a record of spectacular failures alongside his spectacular successes started to look like the most defensible choice. Neville Chamberlain's government had collapsed under the political weight of the Norway campaign, and the irony was not lost on anyone who was paying attention that Churchill himself, as First Lord of the Admiralty, had played a significant role in planning and advocating for that campaign, the failure of which had brought down the government that then appointed him as its replacement. He had spent most of the 1930s in the political wilderness, delivering speeches in the House of Commons that his colleagues found embarrassing, writing articles and giving warnings that the political class found alarmist and counterproductive and damaging to the patient diplomatic work of managing German ambitions through reasonable accommodation. He had been right. He had been right when being right was not merely unpopular but actively career-limiting, when the weight of respectable professional opinion was arrayed against him and the men who agreed with him were a small and largely marginalized minority. He had watched Munich happen and watched the men who made Munich congratulate themselves on their statesmanship and their pragmatism and their willingness to make the hard choices that romantic idealists and warmongers were too inflexible to consider. And now, vindicated by the catastrophe that he had spent years predicting and that everyone else had spent years insisting would not happen, he was Prime Minister, 3 weeks into the job, and he was being asked to consider whether Britain should open negotiations with the man and the system he had spent a decade warning the world about. What happened in the War Cabinet meetings that took place between the 26th and the 28th of May 1940 is one of the most consequential and least publicly understood episodes of the entire war. An episode whose full dimensions were hidden for decades behind the classification of the transcripts and the natural human tendency of the participants to present their roles in it in the most favorable possible light. The meetings were private. The records were not available to historians for many years, and the popular narrative that eventually formed around those days, Churchill standing firm, Churchill defiant and unshakable and invincible, even in the absolute darkest hour of British national experience, is true. But it is true in the way that a silhouette is true, capturing the outline of something real while leaving out everything that gives it texture and weight and human complexity. Halifax pushed hard. He pushed with the patient, persistent persistent, carefully reasoned determination of a man who genuinely believed that the position he was arguing for was not merely strategically sensible but morally required, that the lives of British servicemen and British civilians were worth more than the satisfaction of moral consistency, that the responsibility of leaders was to protect the people in their care, even when protection required choices that were deeply uncomfortable and that history might judge harshly. He raised the possibility of an approach through the Italian ambassador. He raised it again when Churchill deflected it. He raised it in different forms and from different angles, not because he was obstinate or because he had failed to understand the counter-arguments, but because he had heard the counter-arguments and remained unconvinced that they outweighed the weight of the alternative, which was a war that the military assessments available to him suggested Britain might very well lose. Churchill's counter-argument was not primarily strategic in nature, and that is the crucial thing about it, that Halifax, for all his intelligence and all his genuine engagement with the problem, never quite found a way to answer. It operated below the level of calculation and beyond the reach of the kind of quantitative strategic analysis that Halifax was applying, and its logic was not the logic of interests and capabilities and force ratios, but something older and in some ways more fundamental. Churchill believed, and this is the element that separates him not just from Halifax, but from almost every other political leader of his era, and perhaps of any era, that the act of negotiating with Hitler at that specific moment, in those specific circumstances, would itself constitute the decisive and irreversible defeat, regardless of what terms were eventually reached, or what formal independence was preserved in the text of any agreement. Not because the terms would necessarily be intolerable in the immediate term, though he had every reason to distrust any commitment Hitler made, given the consistent and extensively documented history of every previous commitment Hitler had made being discarded precisely when it became inconvenient to honor it, not even primarily because he expected the negotiations to fail, but because the moment Britain formally presented itself at that table, something would happen to the will of the British people and to the moral position of the British state in the world that no subsequent military success, no later change of circumstances, no revision of the terms could undo or reverse. A government that chooses to negotiate with a power that has declared its intention to dominate it has already acknowledged, in the act of negotiating, that the cost of resistance exceeds what it is prepared to pay. And once you have made that acknowledgement, once you have demonstrated to the world and to your own population and to every occupied nation watching from under German boots that there exists a price at which you can be made to flinch, you have surrendered the one asset that makes a smaller power dangerous against a larger one, the absolute, credible, demonstrated, unconditional commitment to continue regardless of consequences. There is a moment in those deliberations that I have returned to many times over the years, a moment that the formal diplomatic language of cabinet minutes can barely contain. Churchill adjourned the 5-man war cabinet and went to speak privately with the full Autre Cabinet 25 ministers, the broader government, the men who ran the departments and managed the machinery of a state that was trying to function with some semblance of normality, even as the world that existed within was disintegrating at a pace that made normal functioning seem almost surreal. He told them honestly what was happening. He told them that there were serious, responsible, well-intentioned people within the government who believed that seeking a negotiated settlement was the right course, that fighting on against an enemy of demonstrated overwhelming superiority without any realistic immediate prospect of decisive assistance was not courage, but recklessness dressed up as principle, that the lives of British people were worth more than the maintenance of a postia that the military situation could not actually sustain. He told them all of that, because he was not going to lie to them or manage them or present the situation as something other than what it was, and then he told them what he himself believed, with a directness and a passion that he had, to some extent, withheld in the formal cabinet meetings where the need to manage Halifax carefully and keep the deliberations from becoming irreconcilable had imposed a certain diplomatic restraint on the full expression of his conviction. He told them that if Britain negotiated with Hitler's Germany, it would not survive as a free nation, regardless of what terms were written down, regardless of what guarantees were given, regardless of how the agreement was framed or what legal fictions it employed to describe the relationship between the two states. that whatever independence was preserved in the terms would erode, would be nibbled away, demand by demand, concession by concession, until the independence was gone, and only the legal fiction remained. He told them that he had considered the question from every angle he could find, that he had given the opposing argument every benefit of the doubt he could honestly extend, and that his conclusion was unchanged and, in his own mind, unshakable. He would rather see London burning. He would rather lose every material thing that Britain had built and accumulated across the centuries of its history. He would rather fight in circumstances where fighting seemed hopeless than surrender the thing that could not be rebuilt once it was surrendered. Not the buildings, not the institutions, not even the people, as precious as all of those things were, but the idea that free nations could and would stand against totalitarian power regardless of the cost, and that the decision to do so was not negotiable. The reaction in that room was something that Churchill himself, in the private notes he kept, described as unlike anything he had experienced in a long political life. These were not soldiers or heroes or men selected for their emotional expressiveness. They were politicians and civil servants and administrators, men whose professional formation had taught them to manage complexity and suppress sentiment and present a measured face to the world, regardless of what was happening beneath it. And they responded to what Churchill said with something that broke through all of that professional formation and came from somewhere deeper and less manageable. Cheer. Men stood from their chairs and moved toward him. There were hands gripping his arm, hands on his back. Men who would never, in ordinary circumstances, have allowed themselves such open displays of feeling standing there in a government room in the middle of a catastrophe with tears on their faces. What came out of them in that moment was not the relief of men who had been given permission to feel brave. It was the recognition, visceral, sudden, almost shocking in its intensity, that someone had finally said aloud the thing that they had all known, in the most private and least comfortable part of themselves. To be true, you cannot negotiate your freedom with the man who has made its destruction. The organizing principle of his ambition, the logic doesn't hold, the arithmetic doesn't work. Some things are not subject to bargaining, because the very act of placing them on the table is the act of losing them. When Churchill returned to the War Cabinet and reported what had happened, the balance shifted in a way that Halifax, for all his intelligence and determination, could not reverse. He made one more serious attempt the following day, raising the Italian ambassador question, again with the patience and persistence of a man who believed his position was right, and that the right position deserved to be pressed until it was genuinely exhausted. Churchill deflected it, but the deflection was different now, and both men could feel the difference. The outer cabinet meeting had done something that formal argument between 5 people in a room could not do. It had established that the instinct Churchill was acting on was not his alone, was not the product of a particular personal temperament or an individual unwillingness to accept unpleasant reality, but was something shared by the broader government and, as Churchill had always believed it would be, by the British people themselves, if they were trusted with the truth of the situation and the real nature of the choice. The door to negotiations stayed closed. It stayed closed on the 26th and the 27th and the 28th, when the last serious attempt was made. And then, with France's formal armistice still weeks away, with the evacuation of Dunkirk still in its final desperate days, with the outcome of everything that followed still entirely unresolved and genuinely unknowable, the decision was made. Britain would fight, alone if necessary, with whatever it had and whatever it could build and borrow and improvise, against an enemy whose military power had just demonstrated, in the most conclusive terms available, that it could destroy forces far larger than anything Britain could currently field, for as long as it took, against odds that the available evidence described as formidable, toward an outcome that no one in that room could honestly claim to know. What followed from that decision was not swift triumph or easy vindication. What followed was for more years of warfare that extracted a cost in British lives and British treasure and British cities and British families, that the people who paid it carried for the rest of their lives, and that their children and grandchildren felt in ways they sometimes couldn't quite name or trace back to their origin. The Battle of Britain came first. The grinding, daily, brutal aerial campaign through the summer and autumn of 1940 that killed thousands of RAF, aircrew, and ground personnel, that destroyed hundreds of aircraft, that pushed the air defense system to and several times beyond the limit of its capacity. That was decided in the end by margins so narrow that historians still argue about the precise point at which the outcome was determined. The Blitz came next, the sustained campaign of night bombing against British cities that began in September 1940 and continued for months. That killed more than 40,000 British civilians, that left large sections of London and Coventry and Liverpool and Bristol and Southampton and Plymouth and dozens of other cities in states of destruction, whose physical traces were still visible decades later. And then the longer, slower, grinding attrition of a global war fought in North Africa and Southeast Asia and the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and eventually across the beaches and fields of France and the forests and rivers of Germany itself. A war that killed hundreds of thousands and wounded hundreds of thousands more and left almost no family in Britain untouched by loss of some kind. Churchill had chosen all of that. He had not chosen it blindly or carelessly or without understanding what he was buying with his defiance. He was a man of wide historical reading and hard practical experience, and he understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from having thought seriously about war for most of a long adult life, exactly what he was committing his country to when he kept that door closed. He was not choosing certainty of victory. He was choosing the possibility of victory at the cost of a certainty of suffering, against the alternative of a certainty of defeat, slower, more decorative, more legally coherent, but defeat nonetheless. And the loneliness of making that choice, of being the person who decided what other people's lives would be spent on, of knowing that the men who would die in the coming years would die because of a decision made in a room in London in the last days of May 1940, was something that he carried privately in ways that his public performances of invincible resolve necessarily concealed. The consequences of that decision radiated outward through time in ways that took years to fully manifest, and that connected to each other in chains of causation that are still being traced by historians. The signal sent to the United States was immediate, and, in retrospect, this is Franklin Punto. Roosevelt had been watching the situation in Europe with a strategic clarity that his public statements were required to obscure, because the domestic political reality he was operating within a public deeply resistant to involvement in another European war. A Congress shaped by isolationist sentiment, a nation that had sent its sons to France once before within living memory and had no appetite for doing so again, made any public acknowledgement of his actual assessment politically impossible. Understood, and had understood for some time, that a Europe reorganized under German dominance would represent a threat to American security and American values that no amount of geographical distance could insulate the United States against. But he could not go to Congress on the basis of strategic theory. He needed a demonstration, something concrete and visible that Americans who had no particular interest in European affairs and no desire to bear the costs of involvement could understand and respond to. He needed to show that Britain was worth backing, not as an act of sentiment or alliance obligation, but as an investment in a nation that was genuinely fighting, that was not going to collapse or negotiate itself into irrelevance before American support could reach it and be put to effective use. Churchill's refusal to negotiate provided exactly that demonstration. The destroyers' four bases agreement, the Lend-Lease Act, the entire apparatus of American material support that kept Britain in the war through its most difficult years, none of it was politically achievable without the foundation that Churchill's decision laid in May 19. The consequences for the occupied nations of Europe were less visible from the outside, but no less profound for the people living inside them. Resistance movements are sustained not only by the private courage of their members, though that courage was real and extraordinary and deserves every acknowledgement it has ever received, but by the belief that the resistance is connected to something larger, that the war is still ongoing, that the current reality is not the permanent reality, that somewhere beyond the occupied territory the fight is continuing and the outcome is still open. If Britain had negotiated, If the last significant unoccupied democracy in Western Europe had formally accepted the new order and worked out a modus vivendi with German power, the message to every French partisan and Dutch underground operative and Polish courier and Norwegian saboteur would have been as devastating as any military defeat. The outside world had accepted this. There was no longer a larger struggle to be part of. The resistance was purely personal, purely internal, sustained by individual integrity rather than any realistic connection to a cause that might eventually prevail. Some would have fought on anyway, because some people are simply constitutionally incapable of accepting what is intolerable, regardless of the odds. But many would not. And the intelligence networks, and escape lines, and resistance infrastructure that helped sustain the Allied war effort and saved thousands of lives depend on people who were willing to risk everything because they believed their sacrifice was part of something that had a future. Churchill understood all of this: the American dimension, the resistance dimension, the signal it would send to the Empire, and to the Dominions, and to the neutral nations. Calculating where the weight of history was eventually going to fall. He understood it with the analytical clarity of a man who had spent his entire adult life thinking about war and power and the relationship between will and outcome in situations where the material balance of forces seemed to argue against any outcome other than the obvious one. He had read enough history to know that the obvious outcome was not always the actual outcome, that wars were decided by things that did not appear in order of battle assessments, that the capacity of human beings to sustain effort beyond the point where rational analysis suggested effort was worthwhile was itself a military variable of the first importance. He had also read enough history to know that he might be wrong, that the capacity for self-deception in men under extreme pressure was enormous, that the history of warfare was full of leaders who had confused their own determination with a genuine strategic advantage and had spent other people's lives on the distinction. He held both of those things simultaneously, the possibility that he was right and the possibility that he was wrong, and he chose anyway, because the alternative was to choose a path whose endpoint he could see clearly and that led, with or without negotiation, in only one direction. I want to close by telling you something that very rarely appears in the formal accounts, something that gets absorbed and lost in the grandeur of the rhetoric and the sweep of the historical narrative and the natural human tendency to smooth the rough edges off of events once their outcome is known. In the days after the war, cabinet deliberations were concluded, after Halifax had withdrawn his push for negotiations and the course had been set and the decision was as irrevocable as any decision made by fallible human beings in conditions of extreme uncertainty can be. Churchill reportedly broke down and wept. Not in the cabinet, not before the press, not in any of the public appearances he was making during those same weeks. The visits to bombed sites and military installations and working-class neighborhoods. The performances of invincible national confidence that the moment required of him and that he delivered with a conviction and a craft that were genuine, even when the confidence behind them was something he had to manufacture fresh each morning from whatever was left over from the previous night. In private, alone or nearly alone, the full weight of what he had chosen, the men who were going to die, the cities that were going to burn, the families that were going to be broken, the suffering that was now as certain as anything in an uncertain world. And underneath all of it, the possibility that none of it would be enough, that all of it would be spent and the outcome would be defeat anyway, came down on him in a moment of private grief that he allowed himself and then folded away, because there was work to do and the work could not wait, and no one outside that private moment was ever going to see it. That is what I want you to carry away from this. Not the speeches, which were magnificent. Not the defiance, which was real. Not the image of the old man with a cigar staring down the darkness of history with an expression that has been reproduced 10,000 times in 10,000 different contexts until it has become almost an icon rather than a human face. Carry the private grief. Carry the knowledge that he felt the full weight of what he was choosing, that the decision was not made from a position of invulnerability or certainty or freedom from the ordinary human experience of fear and doubt and the particular agony of not knowing whether you were right. It was made from exactly the same position you would be in. The same doubt, the same fear, The same inability to see around the corner of the future and know whether the bet you were making with other people's lives was going to come in, and he made it anyway. Not because he was constitutionally different from other men, not because the ordinary human experience of uncertainty simply didn't apply to him, but because he understood something that the situation he was in made visible with a terrible clarity. That there are moments when the only honest and coherent and ultimately human thing to do is to act on what you believe, even when what you believe cannot be proven, to hold the door open against the weight of all the evidence that says close it, and to trust that the possibility of something different is worth more than the security of accepting what seems inevitable. The world you are living in right now, the world in which the nations of Western Europe rebuilt themselves after the war and extended rather than contracted the reach of democratic governance. The world in which the worst version of the 20th century, the version that the arithmetic of May 1940 most directly pointed toward, did not come to pass, is in no small and no trivial part the consequence of what one man decided to believe in a room in London, spring of a year that most people alive today never lived through and can barely imagine. Not decided to do, decided to believe. Because the decision was, before it was a military calculation, or a political judgment, or a strategic assessment, a decision about what was worth believing in, when believing in it was the most costly and the most dangerous thing in the world. That is not mythology. That is not the comfortable story that nations construct around their darker histories to make the darkness more bearable. That is what happened. And it is far more terrifying, and far more extraordinary, and far more worth your serious attention than any version of it that has had the difficulty removed.